Warrant Officer Derek Holt picked up Nadia Ferris's notebook and dropped it in the trash. The sound it made landing on the metal bottom wasn't loud, but everyone in the briefing room heard it. "We don't do math on paper here," he said. "We do math on the system. The system costs $400,000, and the Army didn't spend that so someone could sit there with a pencil like it's 1943. Nobody moved. Nobody disagreed out loud. Nadia looked at the trash can, at the notebook her father had given her the year before he died. His handwriting still on the inside cover, the declination tables he'd worked out by hand for the ranges in Wainwright where he'd trained recruits for 22 years. Then she looked at Holt, and she didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply reached into the trash can, picked the notebook up, and set it back on the table in front of her without a word. That was the moment, though nobody in the room knew it yet. That was the moment the story really started. The invitation to the Canadian Forces Small Arms Concentration had arrived at CFB Shiloh 6 weeks earlier, and when Captain Danielle Ford, the unit's marksmanship officer, read Nadia's name on the list she'd submitted upward, she'd asked 3 different people whether the selection criteria had been properly applied. Not because she doubted Nadia specifically, because she doubted whether the people above her would allow the name to stand. Ferris had been at Shiloh for 4 years. She was a weapons technical officer, one of the few women in that stream, and she had a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. Ask the range staff and they'd tell you she was the best natural shot they'd seen come through in a decade. Ask the senior leadership and you'd hear something more careful. Words like unconventional, words like doesn't integrate well with system-based methodology, words that meant she trusted her own judgment over the equipment, and that in a culture that had spent 15 years and several $100 million building trust in equipment was almost a character flaw. She was 31 years old. She'd grown up in Petawawa, Ontario, the daughter of a man who'd spent his career teaching other men to shoot and had come home every evening and taught his daughter the same things in the backfield behind their house, in all seasons, in all weather, until the knowledge was no longer in her head but in her hands. Her father's name was Raymond Ferris. He'd died of a stroke 2 years earlier, sitting in his truck in the driveway after a morning at the range, the engine still running, his coffee still warm. She'd been the one to find him. She didn't talk about that. She talked about very little, which was also something people noted when they were deciding what category to put her in. The concentration was held at CFB Gagetown, New Brunswick, in November, which in Gagetown meant cold that came off the Oromocto River with a specific kind of damp authority. The cold that found the gaps in your kit and reminded you it had been doing this longer than Gore-Tex had existed. 38 competitors from across the forces, snipers, armorers, combat engineers who'd cross-trained for marksmanship. One Navy clearance diver who had ended up here through a sequence of postings he described as the result of a clerical error, but which his range scores suggested was anything but. Nadia arrived on the coach from Fredericton, and she was one of 4 women in the group, which meant she was immediately visible in a way that had nothing to do with her record and everything to do with arithmetic. She'd been the visible one in every room she'd entered since basic, and she'd learned the same thing anyone learns when they're perpetually visible. You don't change your walk. You don't speed up. You don't slow down. You don't adjust your posture for the room's attention. You walk at exactly the pace you intended to walk, and the room either adjusts or it doesn't. And that's information about the room, not about you. The equipment staging area was where she first encountered Holt. He was the senior WO on the coordination side, which meant he controlled scope assignments, range access, and the scheduling that determined when each competitor shot which phase. He was 44, career infantry, with a jaw that looked like it had opinions and a way of holding his clipboard that communicated he considered himself the most important person in any room he occupied. He looked at Nadia's kit and then at the data books she carried under her arm, and he asked her whether she'd been briefed on the integrated ballistic system that all competitors were expected to use for the concentration-scored phases. She told him she'd read the documentation. He told her the documentation was not the same as being briefed, and that the briefing was mandatory, and that there was a reason the forces had invested in standardized solutions and that personal methodologies were appropriate at the unit level. But this was an inter-service concentration, and the protocol existed for reasons that individuals didn't always have the full picture to evaluate. She listened to all of this without expression, in the way that people who have heard versions of the same speech many times listen to the newest version. Then she asked where the briefing was scheduled. He told her 0800 the next morning. She was there at 0750. The other woman who made an early impression was Master Corporal Yvette Tran, a signals technician from Valcartier who had ended up in competitive marksmanship the same way Nadia had, through scores that had made her chain of command reluctantly pay attention. She sat down next to Nadia at dinner the first night and said, without introduction, "You're Ferris. I heard about you from someone at Wainwright. What did they say?" "That you shot a 200-yard group with iron sights in a crosswind that my scope couldn't hold." She paused. "My scope is very good. The wind doesn't know what your scope costs." Tran looked at her for a moment. "Your dad was the marksmanship warrant at Petawawa for 18 years. I did a course there. He told us that the difference between a shooter and a marksman was whether they trusted the instrument or became the instrument." She was quiet for a second. "I didn't understand it then. I think I do now." Nadia didn't respond to that directly. She knew the quote. She'd been hearing it since she was 8 years old, standing in the back field with her breath misting in the October air, learning to feel the wind before she thought about it, learning things that, when she tried to explain them later, came out sounding like philosophy and were, in fact, just physics that had been absorbed deep enough to become instinct. The briefing the next morning confirmed what she'd expected. The integrated ballistic system was sophisticated. It pulled atmospheric data from sensors positioned around the range complex, ran real-time calculations on bullet drop and wind deflection, and fed corrections directly to a digital display mounted above each competitor's assigned optic. It was genuinely impressive engineering. It was also, Nadia had spent enough time thinking about this to have an opinion, a system that created a specific kind of dependency. You trusted it right up until the moment conditions changed faster than the sensors could update, or temperature hit an edge case the calibration didn't account for, or someone had failed to properly zero the unit that morning, at which point you were either a marksman or you were a person holding expensive hardware and hoping. Her assigned scope was a unit she hadn't used before, which wasn't remarkable at a concentration. Standardized equipment was part of the point. What was remarkable was that when she mounted it and looked through it, the zero was off. Not dramatically, not embarrassingly, but off in the specific way that would compound with distance. At 200 yards, it would barely matter. At 800 yards, it would matter considerably. She went to Holt and told him. He told her that all optics were checked and certified before issue. She told him she understood that, and that the zero on her assigned unit was nevertheless incorrect. He told her to run the factory reset and allow the system to self-calibrate. She ran the factory reset. The system self-calibrated to the same incorrect zero. She went back to Holt. He told her that if every competitor came to him with individual concerns about their issued equipment, the concentration would never begin, and that the system's aggregate accuracy across multiple conditions had been independently validated, and that perhaps the issue was with her reference point rather than the instrument. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to decide there was nothing productive left to say, and she went back to her lane. That afternoon, she pulled the scope off entirely. Not because she was making a statement, because the zero was wrong, and a wrong zero was worse than no optic at all, and she'd been shooting irons since she was old enough to hold a rifle level. She set the scope on the table beside her shooting position and worked through the afternoon qualification with the backup iron sights the rifle carried, the ones nobody at a modern military concentration expected anyone to actually use. The scoring for the afternoon phase came back, and there was a pause before her scores were read aloud, the kind of pause that happens when a number doesn't match the expected column. Across the range, she heard someone say, "That can't be right," in the specific tone of someone who had not yet decided whether to be impressed or skeptical. She found out later the comment had come from Major Peter Wolfe, the senior presiding officer, who had been watching from the elevated observation position, and who had, it emerged, been watching for some time. That evening in the mess, the seating geometry told its own story. Nadia took a tray to a table near the window, and the space around her did what space does when people aren't sure how to categorize something they've just seen. Tran sat down after a few minutes. A young sergeant named Kowalski, from the Edmonton garrison, sat down shortly after, not because he decided anything in particular, but because he has had the quality some people have of not noticing social geometry to him, which was, Nadia had found, often the most genuine quality in a room. Woholt sat at the central table and was talking, which meant he was processing, which meant the afternoon had registered. She heard fragments, iron sights at that distance, and wait until the longer stages. And it's day one. Anyone can have a good day one. She'd been hearing that particular logic her entire career. The first exceptional result was always a fluke. The second was a pattern. The third was something that required explanation. She was patient. She had learned patience from a man who had spent 20 years teaching recruits, who couldn't yet feel the wind, and who had never once suggested that their inability to feel it yet was a permanent condition. It was Kowalski who mentioned, on the walk back to the barracks, that he'd heard Holt had filed a notation about her choice to use irons. A notation about what? About methodology deviation from competition protocol. She thought about that for a moment. Protocol allowed iron sights. Iron sights had been on the approved equipment list since the competition's founding. The notation was not a rules issue. It was a documentation strategy, creating a paper trail that could become a narrative if she needed to be managed. She thanked Kowalski and filed the information in the same place she filed wind readings. Not for now, for when it would be relevant. The second day brought the long-range precision phase, and the long-range precision phase brought Major Wolfe down from the observation deck and onto the range. He didn't say anything. He stood 30 feet away and watched with the binoculars he carried personally, not the issued ones, but a pair she recognized as ex-military surplus, the heavy-bodied kind that predated autofocus by a generation, the kind that required you to actually look at something before you could see it clearly. She respected that, in the way she respected any tool, that demanded something from the person using it. The phase was a 5-shot series at distances the range officer didn't announce until the competitor was in position. Nadia drew 800, 650, 920, 750, and then 1,100 yards in that order. The 1,100 came last, which the range officer announced with the specific flatness of someone who had been told to keep a neutral tone and was managing it with some difficulty. She went through the first 4 shots with the rhythm she'd built over a lifetime of cold mornings and had been maintaining since she arrived. The wind at Gagetown was a different animal from what she was used to in Manitoba. Humid, inconsistent, with a tendency to shift direction in the stand of spruce at the range's northern boundary and arrive at the firing line as something subtly different from what the flags were showing. She cataloged this as she shot, not consciously. The same way you catalog the sound of traffic when you're driving, not storing each instance, but building a model. The 1,100-yard shot was the one that changed the texture of the day. At 1,100 yards, an iron sight does not resolve the target in the way an optic does. The target exists at the edge of what the eye can reliably confirm, and the computation that produces a successful shot is not really calculation at all, not at that stage. It is the summation of everything you know, turned into a single committed motion. You don't fire it where you see the target. You fire it where you know it is. Her father had explained this to her when she was 11, standing in the back field in late November with the temperature around -8 and her fingers cold inside her gloves. He'd said, at a certain distance, the rifle stops being a tool and starts being a conversation, and the conversation only works if both parties know what they're talking about. She fired. The range fell quiet in the seconds before the score came back on the radio. Not the quiet of people waiting, the quiet of people who have stopped whatever they were doing because something nearby has demanded their full attention without asking permission. Hit dead center, 1,100 yards. Major Wolfe lowered his binoculars. He said nothing aloud, but she saw him turn to the man beside him. Colonel Isabeau Renard, the concentration's commanding officer, who had arrived at the range unannounced sometime in the last 40 minutes, and say something short. She couldn't hear what. She didn't need to. She had spent her career learning to read the posture of people in authority who were having their expectations reorganized, and Wolf's posture said very clearly that he was in the middle of exactly that process. That night, she found her data book moved. It was still in her room. Nothing in it had been altered, but she packed her gear in a specific sequence, the same sequence her father had drilled into her during field exercises. The sequence where everything has a place, and the place being wrong means something, and the sequence was disrupted. She sat on the edge of her cot and looked at the book, her father's handwriting on the inside cover, the declination tables he'd worked out for Wainwright. His name in the corner, Woe to our Ferris, and under it in smaller letters, the kind a person writes when they're not sure if anyone but them will ever read it. For Nadia. Learn it until it's in your hands. She didn't report the book immediately. She thought about what reporting it meant at this stage. She had a moved notebook. She had no proof of who had moved it. She had a notation filed against her methodology, and a senior WO who had expressed specific and documented skepticism about her approach. If she reported the book now, she had a complaint. If she waited and collected more, she had a pattern. She put the book back in its place, exactly where it belonged, and she lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling and let herself have 30 seconds of being angry about it. Her father's rule, 30 seconds, then you're working again. She never needed the full 30. The third day started with an equipment problem that was not, on examination, accidental. The rifle she'd been assigned had been flagged overnight for a maintenance check. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that the flag had been entered into the system at 0217, which was a time when the armory was not officially staffed, which meant someone had accessed the system outside scheduled hours, and the maintenance check that resulted required her rifle to be pulled from the morning phase while a replacement was sourced. The replacement was a different platform. She'd trained on it, but not extensively. The gas system had a different feel. The trigger brake was slightly heavier. These were not insurmountable problems. They were, however, specifically the kind of problems that accumulated alongside each other until they stopped being individually dismissible. Kowalski found her in the equipment area and said, without particular drama, that he'd been awake at 0200 and had seen lights in the armory corridor. She asked him who. He said he couldn't say with certainty. He said he thought she should know what he'd seen. She thanked him and thought about the shape of what she was looking at. The data book moved, the methodology notation filed, the rifle flagged, each one deniable on its own. Together they were a story, and it was not a complicated story, but it was one she needed to be able to tell completely before she told it to anyone who could do something with it. That afternoon, Colonel Renard came to find her. This was not a conversation Nadia had arranged. Renard arrived at her lane between phases with the directness of a woman who had spent 30 years making decisions and had no patience left for the versions of conversations that circled the actual point. "Ferris," she said. "Ma'am." Renard looked at the replacement rifle, then at the iron sights. "Walk with me." They walked to the far end of the range, out of earshot of the scoring position. Renard was a tall woman, French-Canadian, with the specific economy of movement of someone who thought in plans and executed in steps. She had a reputation in the forces for exactly one thing consistently applied. She was fair in a way that cost her when fairness was inconvenient, and she did it anyway. "I've been watching your scores," she said. Nadia said nothing. "I've also been reviewing the administrative activity on your file since you arrived." Renard's voice was even. "The methodology notation, the maintenance flag on your primary rifle." She paused. "The access log for the armory at 0217. Nadia waited. "I want to know," Renard said, "whether anything else has happened that isn't in the system." Nadia told her about the data book. Renard absorbed this without visible reaction. Then she said, "I want you to understand something. The investigation that's already underway is not contingent on your participation, but your participation will determine how completely the record reflects what actually happened here." She looked at Nadia directly. What actually happened here matters, not just for you. Nadia understood what she meant. In a room full of people watching a woman outperform expectations, the decision to manage that performance, rather than acknowledge it was not a private decision, it was an institutional one. It said something about what the institution believed about itself. My father served 22 years, Nadia said. He trained more people than I can count. He put in for a chief warrant commendation in his last year of service for a training program he built from nothing that improved range qualification rates across 3 bases. She looked at the distant tree line. The paperwork got lost in a reorganization. He retired without it. He never mentioned it after. She paused. I found out about it from his unit's records after he died. Renard was quiet for a moment. What was the program? He called it reading the ground. Teaching shooters to use environmental data the way they use their instruments. Wind, temperature, humidity, terrain features. Not as variables to calculate, but as information to understand. She paused. The ranges I shoot best on are the ones where conditions make the equipment less reliable. I think that's what he meant for me to understand from it. Renard looked at her. The look was not sympathy exactly. It was the recognition of someone who had been carrying a specific kind of weight for a long time, and who understood that weight from the inside. Shoot the afternoon phase, Renard said. Just shoot, let me take care of the rest. She shot the afternoon phase. The replacement rifle didn't feel right until the 3rd shot, and then it felt like what it was. A well-made tool that worked if you worked with it, which was what every tool was when you understood it correctly. She found the calibration not in the equipment but in herself, in the adjustments she made below the level of thought, in the body of knowledge her father had put there over decades of cold mornings. By the 6th shot, the rifle felt like hers. She finished the phase with 11 hits from 12. The 12th was a miss at 980 yards in a gust that changed direction between the moment she fired and the moment the bullet arrived, and she had known it the instant the round left the chamber. Sometimes the wind lied. Her father had told her that too. Sometimes you read it exactly right and it changed its mind. That wasn't failure. That was physics being honest about its own limits. The phase ended and she stood and cleared her rifle and found Tran waiting at the staging area. Tran said nothing for a moment, then she said, 11 out of 12, with a rifle you'd never shot before, in that. She gestured at the range. The wind was still rolling in off the river, steady and opinionated. How? The rifle is the tool, Nadia said. It came out without planning. Her father's words, not hers, or hers now, because 20 years of being told something eventually meant it stopped being someone else's and became the structure of how you thought. You don't adapt to the tool adapts to you. If it doesn't, you work with what's there. Tran looked at her for a long moment. I want to learn to do that. Find a good instructor, Nadia said, and then, because it was true, and shoot in weather. Shoot when everything's working against you. That's when you find out what you actually know. The next morning, Holt was gone. His absence from the 0600 briefing was noted without explanation by the range W who took his place, who was a quieter man with the manner of someone who had been told what he needed to know and was proceeding accordingly. 2 other names were also absent from the morning phase list, a corporal from the logistics side and a sergeant from base administration whose presence at the concentration had never been entirely explained. Nadia had known something was coming. She hadn't known the timing. She'd spent the previous night cleaning her issued rifle, the original one, returned to her at 2100 after what the armory sergeant described, with careful language, as a flagging error, and thinking about what Renard had said. Let me take care of the rest. She'd spent her career not trusting that sentence when it came from people who hadn't earned it. Renard had earned it in 30 minutes, which was either very fast or the product of 30 years of evidence that Nadia simply hadn't had access to until now. The final day of the concentration came in under a sky, the color of old pewter, the specific November sky that meant business, that meant the Oromocto River was somewhere nearby working on making your afternoon worse. It was beautiful in the way things that don't care about you are beautiful, completely, without concession. She was awake at 0430, dressed before 0435, and sitting on the edge of her cot with her father's data book open on her knee. not reading it exactly. More the way you hold something that has the weight of a person in it, the feeling of hands that had made marks in it, organized it, carried it. She ran her thumb along the inside cover. His handwriting, the declination tables, for Nadia. Learn it until it's in your hands. She had learned it. At 0600, the briefing room had 36 competitors instead of 38. And Colonel Renard ran it herself, which told the room several things without stating any of them directly. She was precise. She covered the day's structure without elaboration and concluded with one addition to the schedule, delivered in the tone of someone who had designed this edition specifically and was not interested in discussion. The final phase today is a cold bore challenge I've added to the concentration, she said. Distances will not be announced in advance. Conditions will be whatever the morning gives us. Each competitor has one shot at each of 5 distances. No corrections between shots, no zeroing time. She paused. The phase is designed to evaluate what you carry with you, not what your equipment tells you. She looked at the room without looking at anyone in particular. Be at the range at 0900. Nadia walked to the range in the company of Tran and Kowalski and a warrant officer from the Navy side named Arsenault, who had said approximately 30 words across 4 days and was, she'd concluded, one of the most genuinely skilled shooters at the concentration. He was also, she suspected, someone who'd spent his career being underestimated for reasons adjacent to the ones she had, which wasn't something either of them said aloud, but which produced between them the specific ease of people who didn't need to explain their history to each other. The morning gave them wind. Of course it did. Sustained from the northwest at around 25 kilometers per hour, temperature -3, with the humidity that came off river country in November and made every number a variable. The flags at the range's boundaries were telling 3 slightly different stories simultaneously, which was exactly the kind of atmospheric disagreement that made people with sophisticated ballistic computers very busy, and that Nadia had been reading by feel since before she was old enough to have a computer to consult. The 5 distances were announced one at a time at the lane just before each shot. The first was 350 meters, almost casual at this stage after 4 days on this range. She breathed, felt the air, fired, center. The second was 600. The wind had a slight leftward lean that the flags weren't fully representing. She accounted for it with her hold. Not with a calculation, but with the kind of knowledge that lives in your hands when you've been building it long enough. Center. The third was 870. The range officer said the number in the tone of a man giving someone a distance he expected to be complicated. The wind had shifted fractionally in the interval between the second and third shots. She cataloged the shift, integrated it, fired. Center. The range officer said nothing for a moment after the score came back on the radio. Then he wrote it down with the care of a man who was making sure the record was correct. The fourth was 1,040 meters. At 1,000 meters, the cold and the humidity and the wind's 3-story disagreement were each a separate variable, and also one variable, because they interacted. The bullet would leave the muzzle at one moment and arrive at the target at a different moment, and the air in between was not the same air it had been when she'd read it. She needed to fire into where the conditions would be, not where they were. Her father had talked about this specifically. He'd called it firing ahead of the truth, which was not a technical term and was also exactly right. You weren't firing at what you saw. You were firing at your best understanding of what would be true by the time the round arrived. And if your understanding was built from enough accumulated real experience, enough mornings in enough weather, on enough ranges, that understanding was more reliable than a sensor network could be, because the sensor network measured what was there and she knew what was coming. She fired. The 4 seconds between the shot and the radio confirmation were the quietest 4 seconds in the range's recent experience, based on the absolute cessation of ambient sound from the observation position above. Center. The observation deck did not cheer. These were not people who cheered at marksmanship results. What they did was what the observation deck had been doing since day 2. They made the involuntary sound of people who have stopped managing their reactions because the thing in front of them has exceeded the capacity of management. Colonel Renard stood at the railing, with Major Wolf beside her, and she did not move. She watched. The watching had a quality to it, the quality of a person who had understood for some time what was happening, and who was now watching it be confirmed in terms that would be impossible to qualify or reduce. The fifth distance was announced, and it was 1,300 meters. Nadia had shot 1,300 meters before, twice in practice in Manitoba, in spring conditions that were nothing like this. She'd hit once and missed once, and the miss had been a lesson she'd filed carefully, the way she filed all lessons, not as failure but as data. The data said, at this distance, in this kind of wind, the margin for everything is as small as it gets. There is no technique that substitutes for understanding. There is no equipment that replaces the person behind it. There is only what you know, translated perfectly into the one available motion. She thought about her father, not as a grief, not in the moment, as a presence. The way people become present when the thing they taught you is the thing the moment requires. She breathed. She felt the wind. She felt the distance the way she felt it in her bones now, the way all the meters she'd ever shot lived in her body as accumulated physical knowledge. She found the alignment between her eye and the sight and the target at the end of the long gray air. She felt the pause between breaths where the body goes briefly still enough to trust. She fired. The radio was silent for what felt significantly longer than the 5 seconds it was. Hit. Dead center. 1,300 meters. What happened on the observation deck in the following moments was not recorded officially, but Kowalski was up there. He'd gone up between his own shots, and he described it afterward as the closest he'd ever seen a group of career military professionals come to making noise they couldn't justify professionally. Arsenault, who had finished his own phase 3 minutes earlier, stood against the wall with his arms folded, and the expression of a man who had suspected this was coming, and was finding the confirmation satisfying in a way he didn't intend to show. Renard turned to Wolf. "Pull the father's service file," she said. "Today. I want it on my desk before the ceremony." Wolf looked at her. "The commendation he was put up for, the one that got lost in the reorganization," Renard said. "I want to know whether it got lost or whether it got buried. There's a difference, and I intend to know which one it was before I stand in front of that room tonight." She walked inside and she made 2 phone calls. The first was to Personnel Command. The second was to the Chief Warrant Officer responsible for the National Marksmanship Program, a man who had, Renard knew, been looking for a replacement lead instructor for the program's advanced stream for 6 months. The ceremony was held in the garrison's formal mess at 1900, every branch present, full dress. The kind of room that tells you something is being taken seriously by the amount of effort people have made to indicate it. Nadia stood at the front in her uniform, and she was holding her father's data book because she had asked to hold it, and nobody had told her she couldn't. Renard stood before the assembled group, and she spoke without notes, the way she always spoke, because she'd learned early that the things worth saying didn't need to be read. She talked about what the concentration was supposed to measure. She talked about what it had actually measured this week, which was not the same list. She talked about what it meant to carry knowledge that had been built by someone else, and to carry it so completely that it became your own. Then she said, "Before I proceed to the competition results, I want to address something that isn't on the official schedule." The room did what rooms do when they feel a shift. Warrant Officer 2nd Class Raymond Ferris served with the Canadian Forces for 22 years. He built a training methodology that improved qualification rates across 3 bases and was the subject of a commendation recommendation submitted in the final year of his service. She paused. That recommendation was not lost in the reorganization that followed. It was deprioritized through a sequence of administrative decisions that don't reflect well on the people who made them. The documentation exists. It was not acted on. Another pause. Raymond Ferris retired without the recognition he was owed. He died 2 years ago without it. She looked at Nadia. "His daughter is standing in this room tonight, having just done something on a rifle range that I have not seen in 3 decades of service, with equipment her father gave her, and knowledge he spent 20 years building into her, without ever once, as far as I can determine from anyone who knew him, saying out loud that the system had failed him." The room was very quiet. Tonight, On the authority of this command and with the endorsement I've already received from Personnel Command this afternoon, I am initiating the posthumous award of the Chief of Defense Staff Commendation to Warrant Officer, 2nd Class Raymond Ferris, for sustained and exceptional contribution to the development of marksmanship training in the Canadian Forces. She crossed to where Nadia stood. Nadia's hands were steady. Her eyes were dry. She held the data book in her left hand, and she accepted the commendation certificate with her right. And she looked at it for a long moment, at her father's name in the formal language of military recognition, the language that had been owed to him for years and was arriving late and was nevertheless real. She thought about him in the backfield in October. The cold, her breath misting, his hands over hers on the rifle, patient and certain, teaching her things he'd learned over a career and refined over a life, passing them forward into hands that would carry them further than he'd gone. He'd never mentioned the commendation, not once, in all the years she'd known him after it should have come. He just kept teaching, kept getting up early, kept driving to ranges in the dark, kept building the program that someone eventually would recognize whether or not that recognition arrived in time for him to receive it. That was the kind of man he'd been. She pressed the certificate against her chest. Renard placed her hand briefly on Nadia's shoulder, the gesture of a woman who has said everything that needed to be said and knows that what remains requires no addition. The room rose, not on a signal, not in a coordinated way, chair by chair, the way understanding arrives, individually, then all at once, until every person in the room was standing, and the sound they made together was not applause in the conventional sense, but the particular sustained recognition of people who had spent careers learning to identify excellence and who had just watched it walk out of a cold New Brunswick morning, carrying a dead man's notebook and prove, over 1,300 meters of honest gray air, that the best things we learn don't die with the people who taught them. They go on, in the hands of the people who carry them forward, into distances that the teachers never got to see.